I'm here, as David said, I'm a neonatologist at the Mater Mothers Hospital, but I also have the privilege of being the neonatologist on the Australian Resuscitation Council, and in that role I get to represent with Lindsay Mildenhall, my counterpart from the New Zealand Resuscitation Council. I get to be a representative on the International Liaison Committee on Resuscitation, which the neonatal working group for that. So I'm unashamedly representing the ARC to some extent today, and you'll have heard a lot about how the ARC, about adult resuscitation, about how we're focusing on compression first CPR, or even compression only CPR if you're in a single rescuer situation. But the Australian Resuscitation Council, a long time ago when it developed its logo, it recognised the importance of babies, because in fact what you'll see is that their logo represents the breath of life and reflects the primary importance of respiratory resuscitation in the care of newborns. So colleagues of ours in Melbourne and Dublin commented in a paper a number of years ago that neonatal resuscitation is a common and important intervention, but it's also a stressful and sometimes chaotic experience. So why is it that we find it challenging, even those of us who do this often for a living? Babies have difficult airways and their vascular access is difficult. They also have rapidly changing physiology. We're trying to perform this resuscitation against the background of the baby's own adaptation from intrauterine to extrauterine life, which, when you think about it, involves changes in the way every organ and tissue in the body functions during that transition. And so we've got to do what we do against a background of changing physiology. Babies have unique vulnerabilities. We can damage them easily. Their tissues are fragile. Their brains can bleed and things. And what we do, if we do it right or wrong, one way or another, our activities can have lifelong consequences. So it's hardly a surprise that this meets the criteria used in industry for something that's defined as a complex task. And to accomplish complex tasks, they're usually beyond the abilities of any one individual to perform on their own. As was pointed out by our previous eloquent speaker, this is a situation where you need high reliability teams and teams that work together to accomplish a common goal in a time-constrained manner. Now, one of the ways that you can help team function is to have a shared understanding of what it is that you're going to do. And I think that's a really important part of this both national and international consensus development of guidelines that I'm going to describe today. So the ARC has been in existence for 40 years, or 41 years now. I'm wearing my ARC 40th anniversary scarf, but it actually wasn't until 2006 that they first developed newborn resuscitation guidelines. They appointed then Professor Colin Morley to council, and Colin's first iteration of the guidelines were based in the ILCOR 2015 consensus statement on the science of resuscitation with treatment recommendations. Lindsay Mildenhall and I have since undertaken 2 revisions of the guidelines in 2010, 2016, and as you can see, both the extent of public and professional consultation about those guidelines has increased, but in addition, there's been increasing rigour about the evaluation of the evidence and the documentation of strengths of recommendations. And we're now using the internationally recognised grade classification, which any of you who've read or been part of developing a Cochrane review, for example, will probably be becoming familiar with. If I might not get through all my slides today, there's a lot to cover, and so if I don't, both consult the guidelines themselves, which are at www.resus.org.au, or we've published a summary paper in the Journal of Paediatrics and Child Health, which came out a couple of months ago, and which will cover a lot of what I could say today. So in terms of these levels of evidence, one of the issues with the guidelines is that previously all the information was reviewed according to NHMRC standards for levels of evidence, which rated systematic reviews, systematic reviews and RCTs as high-level evidence and observational studies and case studies as low-level evidence. But the grade system actually allows a little bit more subtlety than that. It starts out with the presumption that randomized trials provide high levels of evidence and observational studies low levels of evidence, but you can upgrade or downgrade the evidence depending on a number of characteristics of the study, including the level of bias, the inconsistency, whether or not the population studied was directly the one that you're interested in, and so on and so forth. And observational studies can be upgraded if there's a very large effect, evidence of a strong dose response, and if all plausible confounding wouldn't change your estimate. And so what grade allows you to do is to take parachutes and say that we don't need a randomized trial to call the evidence for their usage high level. So now, because some of the evidence in the guidelines has been reviewed using the old system and some of it the new system, you will find that when you read them that there are two different kinds of terminology. Under the previous system, we said that things were either recommended or acceptable, Class A or Class B recommendations based on the previous level of evidence, but now using grade, for when there's high-level evidence, we use the terminology we recommend, and for weaker level evidence, we suggest. So getting to the guidelines themselves, this is the algorithm. It hasn't changed very much. The only new things in 2016 are as follows. Instead of talking about preventing heat loss at these early steps, we've now placed emphasis on maintaining normal temperature, and I'll come back to that in a moment. We've added in a reminder of the golden minute, and that by a minute of age, a baby should be either breathing spontaneously or with assistance. And we've also changed the table for IV adrenaline from a formula-based approach to a table based on gestational age, which we usually know accurately, whereas the previous formula relied on weight, which we're just having to guess at. So those are all designed to make life a bit simpler, but otherwise the algorithm's much the same. So moving into the guidelines themselves, in 2010 we recommended that training or refresher training in resuscitation should take place at least every year, whereas previous recommendations had been for every second year, and we endorsed that simulation as a useful training tool. But in 2016, given that ILCOR had re-reviewed all the evidence on this stuff, we ended up making a bit more of a nuanced statement that training requires regular reinforcement in clinical practice and or in refresher training courses, but that this training, whether it's on the job or in a simulated environment, should actually occur more frequently than annually, because there's evidence that if you're not using the information all the time, the benefits of training extinguish fairly quickly. Can consist of specific tasks or behavioural skills depending on the needs of the trainee. And the other thing that we've emphasised is that briefings and debriefings during learning activities, whether they're real life or in simulated activities, can help be another good way to reinforce skills. So I thought I'd move on and just give you examples of a couple of babies and how the guidelines might be applied to them. I thought I might start with this little fella. Janet will show him to you later on again, because we've got some common themes in our talks. So compared with the adult, Mary, can you hear me? You know, get on the chest. This baby's actually usually not comatose, not pulseless, maybe trying to breathe. And rather than being dead or even pretending to be dead, he actually just needs help to adapt to extrauterine life and to survive. Okay? So there are a number of resuscitation issues for him that are a bit different from just get on the chest 30 to 2 or whatever. And I think they're along the lines of how can we help him to help us to help him? How should we assess his need for any resuscitation or for specific manoeuvres? And how should we monitor his condition and response so that we know when we're doing enough and not too much? And the most common problem we'll face with a baby like this is what should we do if he's not breathing well? So I'll try and cover some of those things. So the first thing is, when should we clamp his umbilical cord? Now, we had already recommended that in the setting of uncomplicated term birth, we should delay clamping for a minimum of a minute or until cessation of cord clamping. And in uncomplicated preterm babies, that delaying cord clamping for 30 seconds up to 3 minutes was supported by evidence. Since in 2016, we've added a suggestion for delayed umbilical cord clamping for preterm infants not requiring immediate resuscitation, but that was a weak recommendation based on very low quality evidence because there were only a limited number of studies that were at high risk of bias. The Australian placental transfusion study led by Professor William Tano-Mordi is likely to be published by the end of this year, and I'd recommend watching this space because I think there are there's some new learning to come here. In the setting of a compromised infant who needs major resuscitation, the optimal timing is unknown, and resuscitation measures may need to take priority. What about temperature management? I mentioned that we're now emphasising not just trying to avoid heat loss, but to maintain a normal temperature. There are a number of manoeuvres you can use to do this. Improving the ambient temperature to around 26 degrees, using polyethylene bags or wraps without drying or unwrapping the baby in very preterm babies. But the other thing not to forget is that in term babies who are resuscitated and who meet criteria for being at risk of hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, we particularly want to avoid hyperthermia and may need to give early consideration of induced hypothermia. In 2016, we've added this recommendation that admission temperatures to newborn units are predictors of outcome and should be recorded as a quality of care measure. And this is a strong recommendation based on a moderate quality of evidence. This is the upgrading of very large observational trials that show that hypothermia is associated with a dose effect on mortality, with mortality increasing by 28% for each degree below 36.5 at admission. So keeping the baby warm is one of the more important evidence-based things we can do to help improve newborn survival and outcomes. Assessment is still based on the tone, breathing and heart rate of the baby. Subsequent assessment also includes oxygenation, but with recognition that a prompt increase in heart rate remains the most sensitive indicator of resuscitation efficacy. You'll notice that ECG is snuck in there in 2016. I'll come back to that in a minute. This is just a reminder of why oximetry is so important. This is a study done by Colm O'Donnell as part of his PhD when he was working in Melbourne. He showed a whole lot of his colleagues a bunch of video recordings of babies and asked them to note when the baby went pink. Each of the bars is a separate baby, and the bars reflect, and box and whisker plots represent when people thought that these babies turned pink. The mean saturation when babies were perceived to be pink by all 27 observers was 69%, still what most of us would call in the cyanotic range, and ranged from 10% to 100%. the median saturation for individual babies varied from 42% to 93%. So looking by eye, we're pretty rubbish at determining oxygenation. Oximetry, therefore, we recommend early and often, and oximetry also gives you a continuous display of the heart rate if the probe's properly applied within about a minute of birth. The heart rate should still be checked from time to time by auscultation, and oximetry can also play an important role in avoiding hyperoxemia. So ECG has been studied in a few reasonably large observational studies in babies, and we have found that it can be used to more accurately and rapidly display heart rate in the first 3 minutes of life. And in fact, what it tends to find is heart rates that are higher than those that are detected by auscultation or oximetry. And so it may be that one of its main uses is to reduce inappropriate interventions that might be implemented based on falsely low estimates of heart rates as assessed by pulse oximetry or auscultation. But a little bit of caution about it, all the extra complexity this involves about introducing this into the birth suite environment is that there's as yet no evidence as to whether outcomes are improved by early initiation of ECG monitoring. Airway management and mask ventilation. We've said for a long time that most newborn infants don't require suctioning of their nose or mouth or pharynx after birth, that it can actually be harmful and should just be used in selected circumstances. That hasn't changed. We've also not changed most of our recommendations about airway management and mask ventilation. We do think that positive end expiratory pressure may be helpful, especially in preterm lungs, and there's current research going on looking into the role of sustained initial breaths. One of the important things about this is that this device will deliver reliable positive end expiratory pressure, a Tpiece resuscitation device, and you can give a sustained inflation or can vary your length of inspiration, whereas this device, even with a PEEP valve, most of the contemporary models don't deliver reliable PEEP. So we've actually made a bit of a difference from our international colleagues that even though the COSTAR treatment recommendation, which was that there was insufficient evidence to recommend Tpiece resuscitators over self-inflating bags, we have suggested the use of a Tpiece device for delivery of positive pressure ventilation or CPAP during newborn resuscitation. And we've diverged from the international consensus on that because of our belief in the evidence from preclinical studies, but also the resources that are available. ILCOR hesitated to make a recommendation for Tpiece devices internationally because of the cost implications in low resource settings. Our recommendations for pressures and for approach to ventilation really hasn't changed, and we would just remind everybody that for most babies, ventilation can be accomplished with progressively lower pressures and rates as resuscitation proceeds. Supplemental oxygen. Just got these guys up there because both of them were blinded by retinopathy of prematurity, and maybe the music world was the stronger for it. But it's just a reminder that blood oxygen levels of normal newborns can take up to 10 minutes to rise above 90%. And there's increasing evidence that even brief exposure to excessive oxygen can be harmful. There is evidence in term newborn infant studies that 100% oxygen versus room air results in worse survival, increased time to first breath or cry, and markers of oxidative injury, and in preterm infants, more chronic lung disease. So for some time, we've recommended commencing resuscitation of term infants in room air and in preterm infants in blended air and oxygen, somewhere between about 25 and 50, or 30 and 50%, sorry. But the first priority is to achieve adequate inflation of the lungs, followed by increasing the concentration of inspired oxygen only if needed. We have put in a table since 2010 that provides some target saturations for newborn babies. Now, I sometimes get asked how we generate them. Well, they generated those tables. Well, they're based on a landmark study done by Jennifer Dawson in Melbourne, where she laboriously put saturation monitors on a huge number of perfectly normal, healthy term babies who needed no resuscitation whatsoever and were born at sea level, and defined what the normal trends in saturation after birth actually are. And you can see that, and these are the the 5th and 95th centiles here, the 3rd and 97th centiles. So what the ILCOR consensus was is that we should probably be aiming somewhere between about the 25th and 75th centiles in the setting of resuscitation. But interestingly, we can't quite agree on just how to achieve that. So the American Heart Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, sort of basically took a number somewhere in there and then added 5 and said that's what you should do, that's your target. The Europeans are very, very precise people, and so their approach was, so that everybody agreed that we probably should start at around 60, because the baby that's compromised with poor cardiac output, we don't want them to be sort of unusually hypoxic as well. The Europeans are these very precise people, and so they said we should just aim for one number. So you get a dot if you're in Europe, that's where you're headed for. And we Australians are slightly more, we like to hedge our bets, and so, and maybe we're not quite so confident in ourselves, and so we actually came up with a bit more of a range. What we did do is cap our range at 90%. Now, that's not because some perfectly normal, healthy term babies who need no resuscitation at all won't have achieved a SAT in the 90s without our help. But what we were recommending here is that you don't use extra oxygen to get the baby up into that range in the first 10 minutes. There's that line. So intubation, the indications haven't changed. The decision-making can be difficult about this. But one of the things that we just want to point out is that the success rate of intubation is not assured. These are 3 studies done in San Diego, Melbourne, and at the Mater in Brisbane, so all big teaching hospitals. These are skilled neonatal trainees and consultants. And the other thing that's really important is that you can see that intubation takes a while, and this is measured from laryngoscope in to laryngoscope out. In the study that we published in Resuscitation last year, we pointed out that if you take the interval from when the mask comes off the baby's face until when successful ventilation is restored via the endotracheal tube, it's sometimes up to twice as long as this. And so this is a manoeuvre that I think that we've got to think about. If face mask ventilation is proving reasonably successful, then sometimes, we shouldn't just be diving in there trying to get that endotracheal tube in as fast as possible. We possibly should be stabilising the baby and then using rapid sequence induction and things to intubate the baby under more controlled circumstances. These were all recordings made from video recordings made in delivery room settings. So going back to our baby, what can we do to help us to help him? Well, my recommendations would be we keep him warm. We consider deferred cord clamping if he's kind of breathing and showing a little bit of an effort of his own. And we should practice good teamwork in terms of his resuscitation. How should we assess his need for resuscitation and monitor his condition and response? Tone, breathing and heart rate, and oximetry. And what should we do if he's not breathing well? Mask ventilation, consider intubation and surfactant if that's unsuccessful or prolonged. So very quickly, I'll just talk to you about baby M, who was depressed at birth and meconium exposed. Should we suction him for meconium? What do we do if he's not breathing and his heart rate's very slow? Well, the previous recommendations were that there was no evidence for oropharyngeal suctioning after delivery of the baby's head, that if he was vigorous at birth, that airway suctioning should be discouraged because it was likely to cause harm. But we did suggest that if tracheal suction was going to be performed, it should be accomplished before spontaneous or assisted respirations have commenced, very promptly and once only. So the new change in the 2016 guidelines is that there are now 2 studies, both relatively small, both conducted in India, that have been done that show no benefit to the routine intubation of depressed babies exposed to meconium at birth in terms of their outcomes, and this applies to diagnoses of meconium aspiration syndrome, need for assisted ventilation in the NICU, deaths, and so on and so forth. So it's not great evidence, but it's better than what we had before, and we're now saying that there is insufficient published human evidence to suggest routine tracheal suctioning for meconium. I might stop there, and because I think I've slightly more than used up my time. There is more that to the guidelines, but I think that that go to that article or go to the guidelines themselves, and if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to contact me or to post a question to the Resuscitation Council, because we have an FAQ section.